By the rivers there we sat, in Babylon we sat and we wept, and upon the willow trees hung our harps. When we remembered Zion.
Hello, everyone.
Evening, Phil.
Hi, Jord, and hello, Dan.
Hello.
Good to have you on tonight, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, we're looking forward to your theme tonight on looking at exile as a theme in the Psalms. Something that I think we've come across a few times before, Phil, when we've looked at individual Psalms.
That's it. Different speakers have talked about when the nation went into exile, which I'm sure we'll explore more. Where does this fit, Jord, in our series of Psalms at the moment?
Yeah, so obviously because we're not dealing with an individual psalm, we're looking at a sort of a big theme, big picture in the psalm. We're not going to look at any particular book that it fits into. However, I think Dan is going to talk a little bit, if you remember all the way back, Phil, to one of the first sessions, right at the heart of lockdown, back in sort of May 2020 when we began this. And we sort of alluded to the idea of the big picture of how book 3 was around this idea of the crisis point for the psalmist. I think Dan's going to pick up on that a little bit tonight and think about some of those thoughts. So there's nothing really more for me to say apart from Dan, would you like to share some thoughts for us on exile in the Psalms?
Sure, George. Yeah, thank you very much, Jord and Phil, for having me. So yeah, this is, I think, what I want us to do in this session, I'm going to try and get you to do as well, is sort of put a lens on effectively and look at the book of Psalms with this lens, basically, and looking at it with the thoughts of the exile in mind, because when we do that, wherever we look, we can see all sorts of things that relate to it, and it's actually really, really helpful. Hopefully, towards the end of this, you'll agree it's a really helpful way of looking at the Psalms, because it's actually quite practical as well, and it will lead us to Jesus, which is ultimately where the scriptures are sort of heading to. So yeah, that's what I want to do. I suppose the first thing is to just think about what the exile actually was, just remind ourselves. So we're talking about the exile into Babylon. It's around about the year 587 BC. King Nebuchadnezzar comes down and into Jerusalem and destroys the city, destroys the temple, and takes people off into Babylon. So it's a, I don't know, quite a small event in history if you sort of take global history. But if you're looking at the nation of Israel, of which the Bible is about, this people group, this was just a horrific period in the history, a terrible time. Really was something that really defined everything about them from that point onwards. So, I mean, you're aware, I'm sure, there's lots of parts of the scriptures that talk about the exile, aren't there, in periods?
Yeah, loads. We actually, as a church, have been looking at only a few months ago, didn't we, Jord? We had called it the Exile project. If you're scrolling through some of our previous topics for before we started the Psalms for challenging times, we had some images of all that. So was it Nehemiah was when they came out of exile, but even before that we had Daniel, we had Ezekiel, Jeremiah. Quite a lot of the Bible was all with that exile time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, actually, it's the time period, well, sort of coming out of the exile, is the time period when the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, was effectively became what it is and how we know it. It became that, you know, the final shape, the final form of this new Old Testament Hebrew scriptures really was at that point where these things were assembled, and you know, books like Chronicles were sort of finished off or assembled, and Ezra and Nehemiah, of course, written, prophets Malachi, and actually Psalms as well. the Psalms, in their sort of final form, would be post-exile. I think probably the best place to start is that we heard a short excerpt from it. I think it's probably the most famous psalm about the exile. It's Psalm 137. We could just have a quick look at that, and it just emphasizes, I think, the fact that we're dealing with a collection of songs, some of which come from this point in time, and in fact we'll see quite a lot do. So Psalm 137, how shall we sing the Lord's song? By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres. There our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And yeah, you can feel the real, the crisis, can't you, effectively there? How can they forget Jerusalem, and how can they sing songs of joy, songs of praise, Yahweh's songs, God's songs, when they're in a foreign land? They've been taken over the way to Babylon. So, that's probably a well-known psalm, I think, one of the most well-known, popularized in some songs.
Neil, when he did the talk, he did a video a few months back on Zion, and he recalled how that classic By the Waters of Babylon, different renditions normally played tonight, but was popular in his day. And quite a few different songs from this psalm, even though it was quite a sad song about not singing. It's been popularized to be about songs. Yeah,
that's right. So what I want to think through is that, that's about a very specific event. It's about King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon coming down, destroying the city, destroying the temple, and so on. But it's here memorialized in this collection of songs and prayers, and in this book we call the Book of Psalms. And it can have some real power for us, and that's kind of what I want to try and get across. So that's the most famous one, probably, Exile, and I want to sort of just skim through a few of them, and we'll get a feel for what sort of themes they're dealing with. So if we go to 74, Psalm 74, and I don't know, one of you wants to maybe read a few verses from that. You start from the beginning, and we maybe up the first 8 verses.
Sure, go for it, Jord.
Yeah. So Psalm 74, verse 1 to 8. The Maskil of Asaph. O God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, which you have redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion, where you have dwelt. Direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. Your foes have roared in the midst of your meeting place. They set up their own signs for signs. They were like those who swing axes in a forest of trees, and all its carved wood they broke down with hatchets and hammers. They set your sanctuary on fire. They profane the dwelling place of your name, bringing it down to the ground. They said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them. They burned all the meeting places of God in the land.
Yeah, so there you go. This is really quite graphic now, isn't it? About destroying Mount Zion and the sanctuary and so on. And there's one thing to say about these. So some of these we're looking at, they might have had, some of them might have come from an earlier time where there might have been smaller crises. I mean, there were, Assyrian invasions as well and things like that. But there's some now that are clustered in, and we're in book 3 here, which you said right at the start, didn't you, Jord, how that this is kind of that crisis moment. So if your books 1 and 2 are sort of fairly hopeful and thinking about the king and almost, I hate to say this, almost a bit naive, as it were, if you see what I mean. They're kind of looking have a sense of everything's going to be right with the world, and then book 3 is this crash, and here's one of them, Psalm 74, and the sanctuary is the temple, isn't it? That's what that's referring to, the meeting place, the sanctuary, again, the dwelling place of your name. So they're all things that talk about God's, or refer to God's temple. So that's really important. So part of what was awful about the exile when Nebuchadnezzar's armies came is that the temple was destroyed. So that symbolized everything about God's presence with the people and their sort of unity and fellowship with God, and how that had been broken, and symbolized in the destruction of the temple. We could sort of flick on to Psalm 79, which emphasizes it again. Maybe just the first 4 verses of that, if one of you wants to read that.
Mm-hmm. The Psalm of Asaph. O God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They've defiled your holy temple. They've laid Jerusalem in ruins. They've given the bodies of your servants to the birds of the heavens for food, the flesh of your faithful to the beasts of the earth. They've poured out their blood like water all around Jerusalem, and there was no one to bury them. We have a taunt to our neighbors, mocked and derided by those around us.
Yeah, there we go. Again, really graphic, very emotive. These are really terrible times, and it really is a tragedy. And I suppose tragedies happen all around the world, don't they? And this is one of them. And there's awful things that happen. But in this case as well, this is as the prophets and the Psalms and the scriptures say, is because effectively the people of God were performing tragedies on their own people, and it was a city full of sin and so on. So it's just this is human condition all over, and it's an utter tragic event, and it was really shaking them to the core.
It's interesting, like you said, Dan, when you think back to book 1 and 2, with how we've looked so often at the pattern of like CPT, of where there was a complaint because of the tragedy that they were going through, whether that was in the life of David or in the people, and they plead to God. And there was always, like you said, that element, whether it was naivety or whatever, of there was a trust in God that there was something that God would do for them. And just in the first couple of these Psalms of Exile that you've took us to, it's really apparent, isn't it, how there just is no glimpse of hope, or there doesn't seem to be. That the psalmist is completely on their knees here, aren't they? And just the absolute devastation around them. It's just going through those has been really helpful to see that graphically brought across, really.
Yeah, that comes out in Psalm 89 actually as well. So this is the last psalm in book 3. So it's a really important one, because it kind of is these markers. And Psalm 89 starts off, verse 1, I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With your mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. So this sounds really positive. And the whole psalm, all the way to verse 37, is like extolling God for his faithfulness, for his steadfast love, for keeping his promise, for keeping his covenant, and all these things. So verse 3, for example, you have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant, I will establish your offspring forever, and you'll build your throne for all generations. So, Zion's going to continue. Jerusalem's going to continue. The temple's going to be there. The anointed king is going to be there on the throne. All this time, God is faithful. And then you get this verse 38, which is just everything comes crashing down. But now you have cast off and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. You have breached all his walls. You have laid his strongholds in ruins. And that carries on to the end of the psalm. And that's kind of summarizing book 3. There's these promises, there's these covenants, there's God's faithfulness. There is the sin of the people, but God's promises are still there. And you've cast us off, and all these things have happened. And it's this complete, like you say, Jord, almost hopeless situation that is being conveyed. And that's how book 3 ends. Verse 49. Lord, where is your steadfast love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David? That's a charged statement, isn't it? Calling on God, where is it? Where's your steadfast love? I guess we might all feel a bit like that sometimes. We might not have gone through a national crisis like that as these people have been through, but personal crises always happen, don't they? Can be really easy to, and really natural and human to express things like that. Lord, where is your steadfast love? And the fact this is here in Scripture, and these are people who are calling on God, and it's been preserved, shows, I think, that we will feel like that, and it's not like a wrong response to feel like that. It's how we then sort of build on that, and how we sort of reconstruct when everything has just collapsed and fallen apart, and how we get a sense of God's steadfast love and faithfulness when everything seems to have completely deconstructed around us. So yeah, that's book 3. And there's a couple more just to look at in some of the other books. So book 4, I mean, when you looked at that before, George, were you sort of saying book 4 and 5 then start to build back some hope, and as we look back at past generations and things like that? Is that how you were?
Yeah, we sort of painted the picture when we got to book 4. It was interesting. I think I remember having a bit of discussion with Phil about this, that Psalm 90, which is the start of book 4, is a psalm of Moses. And it's just really interesting why, we've had book 1, book 2, book 3, and then Moses, who's right at the start of Scripture, then arrives on the scene. And we sort of had a bit of discussion, didn't we, Phil, about the idea of book 4 is definitely that element of reorientation back to God, where the psalmist is starting to work through the crisis. Maybe if we're thinking about the big picture of the people going back to the land, they had to do this rebuilding, like you said, down of the wall, of the temple, of, the religious society. And I suppose a figure to look back on of how to do that was Moses, because he had to bring them out of a previous exile in Egypt to the promised land. And so we perhaps spoke about that aspect of why this psalm is so pivotal as the opening. And it's all about a dwelling place, isn't it? That God is our refuge and our dwelling place for generations. And you've already alluded to that, about how in Babylon they didn't have that dwelling place, did they? Which is quite significant. So yeah, book 4 we said was this reorientation. And then when we got to book 5, it was the idea of the psalmist being orientated and back to a God-centered way of living. And then the sort of final 5 psalms we termed as this doxology, that there was almost like this crescendo of everything that has breath in Psalm 150 praises the Lord. So it's sort of a nice follow through, really.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, cool. Yeah, that sounds really good. And if we put this lens on, put the Exile lens on now, and think through book 5, that just fits perfectly, like exactly how the nation has gone through this crisis. And what do they do? Well, what can they do but look back at Moses, look back at the Exodus, look back at all these things. And in Psalm 102, so this is in part of book 5, Psalm 102, there's this just absolute gem of a passage, or a section in this psalm, which is from verse 12. So this is a psalm. The title is a prayer of one afflicted when he's faint and pours out his complaint before the Lord. So it's just very much feeling like it should be sort of an individual psalm of distress and so on. But right in sort of in the middle of this psalm. I don't know. One of you want to read verse 12 to 17?
Yeah, I'll
You
read
just
that if
get,
you want.
yeah, you just get, right in the middle, something about building Zion, building the walls again.
But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. You will arise and have pity on Zion. It is the time to favour her. The appointed time has come. For your servants hold her stones dear and have pity on her dust. Nations will fear the name of the Lord, and all the kings of the earth will fear your glory. For the Lord builds up Zion. He appears in his glory. He regards the prayer of the destitute and does not despise their prayer.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? So this, with that exile lens on, with the national catastrophe and the hope of now of rebuilding emerging, you can see how that is almost being paralleled here with kind of an individual's own rebuilding as well, which is quite instructive, I think. So this collection then becomes a way of charting the history of the people and how this terrible tragedy has become then a moment of renewed hope and of renewed turning to God, of reorientation to God, like you say, Jord, and that's how they collectively should come together. And there is going to be pity for Zion and rebuilding, and Ezra and Nehemiah, as you said towards the start, they're parts of the scriptures, the Old Testament, that actually talk about that rebuilding, aren't they? And the building of the city, the building of the temple, and the building of the walls.
Just something here before you move on, Dan. I think that's really stood out to me in a personal level is that in verse 13, the appointed time has come. Whereas one of the things that when you're really low and you're depressed and you feel far from God, that it just seems that there is no end and that there is no way out. And that's what we've seen already in those other books. But here, there is a time when there will be an end to it, but that's often difficult to see. But this reorientation is almost like, now I can see the light at the end, or that the moment has changed. So yeah, definitely. It definitely feels in the pit, when you're in the pit, it certainly doesn't feel like there's a way out. But yeah, there was these people who were able to look forward through the prophets and the looking back at the scriptures. They were able to do this. So just one thing from book 5. There's loads in book 5. There's this whole like mini collection of the Song of Ascents or Song of Degrees, as some of the older versions have called them Song of Degrees. So here they're called the Song of Ascents, and there's 15 of them, I think. I want to say, however many of them there are. They're this sort of mini collection. It's all about going up to Jerusalem. And it starts off with that one, Psalm 120, about being as far away as possible from God, as far away as possible from Jerusalem and from the temple. And they're kind of all about ascending up to Jerusalem. And Psalm 126 is one of them, and it has this great refrain about restore our fortunes, O Lord. So when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. And so some of the translations have about restoring the captivity of Zion, so the captivity or the exile. And there's this really sort of ambiguity, I think, in the Hebrew there. It's whether or not using the word exile or captivity, whether or not it's meant to be a literal thing, restoring the captivity, actually like reversing the exile so the people are coming back, or is it more of an idiom for restoring the fortunes, as the ESV here has translated it? And I don't really know if the answer is one or the other, and whether or not the ambiguity is deliberate, and that there is a sense of coming out of exile. Literally, these people were doing and coming and going up to Jerusalem. But again, the fact that there's this ambiguity, and that becomes a metaphor or an idiom for turning around
people's fortunes, for reorientating and, turning back to God. You can see that just there. And you can see the next psalm is about building the house, and it's God, the Lord, Yahweh, who builds the house. And these are great psalms. So we've gone from the book 3 and that crisis moment, and we've sort of seen that there's a few psalms in the latter 2 books that have something that sort of bring in the hope there. And now, of course, there's plenty more that you could look at. There's one really interesting one, which is back in book 2, which is Psalm 51. So if we look at this one, and then we'll sort of take a step back and think about what are some of the themes that we've seen, and then start to try and think about how we can use those themes for ourselves. So Psalm 51 is a very specific psalm. It tells you exactly what it was about, okay, which is one of those really good ones where you've got the title that says the historical background to it. So it's one of David's psalms. So we're talking about, way before the times of exile. And it's a psalm of David when Nathan the prophet went to him after he'd gone into Bathsheba. So David did a terrible thing. He took someone else's wife, had her husband murdered, and this is dreadful. So he's talking about, have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. And then towards the end of the psalm, it's very much an individual psalm of repentance and turning back to God. And it's David's sin. This is about a very specific moment in history and in his life. And towards the end, he says, verse 16, you, God, will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with the burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you'll not despise. So it's talking about the real meaning of sacrifices. It's, him being repentant and contrite and broken. And God observes that and will sort of bring him out of that situation and can forgive. And then you get these 2 verses at the end. Verse 18, do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. And you kind of got to scratch your head and think, David's time, well, there wasn't even a temple built in Jerusalem. So, and here they're talking about sacrifices and burnt offerings. And they're talking about building up the walls of Jerusalem, as if they've been torn down in exile and so on. And I think what's going on is this is something that's kind of repurposing the Psalm of David and his sin and the experiences that he went through and his repentance and so on. And it's saying, this can be applied like nationally. This can be applied in different situations. So we've seen a little bit of that already about how the experiences of the nation as a whole, to some extent, can be really powerful for individuals and what they go through. And here we've got this the other way now, that almost David and his life is lived out, and the mistake he made, the things that he did wrong, and how he was brought back and turned around back to God. That almost becomes a little proof figure for what the nation ended up doing, and how that there is then hope of building up the walls of Jerusalem and of a temple. That's the point of the sacrifices there, of a dwelling place for God, a sanctuary, a place where God is pleased to dwell, and God's presence is there. So, so we even right back in book 2, where we've these psalms are a majority of them are David's time. They're before the exile. They're that sort of thing. But even then, we've got the hallmarks of the exile, and possibly the editor under God's hand is putting that sort of mark on this particular psalm, and how that these books, these collections in their final form, you can see are all sort of there post-exile, post that dramatic event, and how it is really speaking to the nation of their experiences and how powerful it might be for them.
Fascinating. Wow. Both ways, national to individual, individual to national.
It really reminded me of some words in Ezekiel 37, sort of again, sort of that exile language about how it sort of, I'll just summarize it in verse 19. It talks about how Israel had turned away, they profaned God's name, and so he scattered them just like he did in this exile period. But then it's very similar language, as you were just saying, Dan, to Psalm 51, where you've got in verse 25 about God cleansing them, and in verse 26 giving them a new heart and a new spirit within them. And then it goes on to talk about that glory that will be revealed in them again. And it's just fascinating, isn't it, how scripture works on those different levels. And I think that's really helpful to see it like that in the life of David, the nation and we ourselves, I think you're going to touch on in a little bit, can see the bigger picture and these different lenses that we can take from these various Psalms.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. Is it chapter 36 in Ezekiel, isn't it? I think.
Is it?
Yeah, I think. Is that where you were?
Sorry, sorry. Ezekiel 36, the same verses, wrong chapter. I do apologize.
That's fine. Yeah, that's a really good connection. I've not spotted that, but yeah, Psalm 51, speaking about David's specific time, but being repurposed for the nation. And Ezekiel is talking about that very thing, isn't it? About this new heart, and I will put my spirit within you, and that's what David says in Psalm 51. That's really, really, really good. Okay. So I mean, what have we seen? I mean, there's a lot more we could look at, but we've seen things like, well, the features are the walls broken down, the temple is destroyed, the nations are in God's land, they're defiling it, the people can't go to the temple. That's like the big thing. We thought about people being far away from Jerusalem and Zion, and it's because their transgressions and sins, and yet out of all of this, God can, and in fact there's a belief that God will bring them and out of exile, save them from exile, rebuild them, restore their fortunes. And so, the very structure, the very sort of fabric of the book of Psalms and how they're collected together speak of this, and they become like almost like a prayer book of how to get through this and how express the hope of the people, and because of God's promises to sort of rescue them from this national calamity. So that's looking at the book of Psalms with that lens of exile on it. I just want to go just a little bit further now with that idea, because this is where I said at the start about leading us to Jesus, and as all scripture ends up doing, takes us to the person of Jesus and how he can impact us. But the first sort of stop on the way is just think about the whole of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures as a whole. It's in three parts, which is the law, the prophets, and the writings. And if you look at a Jewish Bible, which was our Old Testament, it will be in those three sections. It's not ordered in the same way as our Bible, and that's a fascinating thing in its own right. The Psalms come in the writings. They're usually the first book of the writings, so that final collection, which was probably assembled around the time of the exile. And the very last book is the book of Chronicles. So Chronicles 1 and 2. So, and it's if we go right to the end of the book of Chronicles, which is chapter 36, so 2 Chronicles 36, and this is all about exile. This is all about what happened. So verse 17 is about the king of the Chaldeans, which is the king of Babylon, came, killed their young men with the sword, and verse 19, burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem. Verse 20, took into exile in Babylon those who escaped from the sword, etc. And it's all the things we've seen throughout in the Psalms. And then you get from verse 22 an expression of hope. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it in writing, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. And that's how it ends. Okay. So there's this charge to go up. And, we need a house at Jerusalem. It's kind of this, just what we saw by using the Psalms as a window to think about exile. We saw this broken down temple. We saw the broken down walls. And now there's this kind of hope of going up to Jerusalem and building a house and a temple for God. What's really fascinating is that in Ezra, so that's the very next book usually in our order, you basically get a repeat of those last few verses. So in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. And you just got to scratch your head and think, well, we just read that. If you look, it's in verse 3, whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up. And it carries on. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And then the story carries on, and Ezra is about people going up and rebuilding. So Chronicles has done a really, really strange thing. The Chronicles has taken the start of Ezra and decided to end it halfway through a sentence. And it's like, and that is the end of the Old Testament. If you've got your Bible in the sort of shape of as it was the Hebrew Scriptures. So it ends midway through a sentence, and it's like an unfinished story. It's like saying, okay, we did go back. Some of us did go back from Babylon, and we did build a sort of a temple, a house. It was a temple, but actually, when you read through Ezra, when people were building it, those that remembered the old one, they were really unhappy because it didn't look anything like it. It was going to be too small. It wasn't what they, it wasn't as impressive or whatever. And you read through Ezra and Nehemiah and Malachi and all these post-exilic books, and it's really basically, it's not quite the same. It's never quite the same. There's never a feeling that God has returned and God's presence has filled the temple. And the fact that Chronicles ends with this let him go up, and there's still a charge, there's still a mission. There's no temple, there's no real presence of God. There's still something to come. And I think that's how the Psalms has sort of led us on. And I think even the whole Hebrew Scriptures leads us on to that. And it kind of begs the question, what's the ending of the story going to be? I think
that's really helpful, Dan, to think about what you've just taken us through with that big picture with of Ezra and Nehemiah and that aspect of rebuilding. And I suppose it brings out the lessons for us, doesn't it, of how we need to rebuild and how we need to refocus our lives on God and look for that hope that is to come. So what sort of big lessons have you gleaned from looking at this theme of exile in the Psalms, Dan?
Yeah, well, so what, the exile through the Psalms brings out the fact that there's still, something, this is an unfinished story, effectively, isn't it? And the Chronicles ends with this unfinished story, and it's looking for God's hope and of rebuilding, and where is that answered? And that's Jesus. That's where Jesus comes in, and all the New Testament and what Jesus is preaching and his good news, the gospel about him and the gospel about the kingdom just feeds into this in its entirety. And this is answering the trauma and answering the problems and answering the questions of the Old Testament. And there's just a couple of passages that we could just perhaps look at, but literally it's right through the New Testament about Jesus building this temple, and it's this temple that is full of people, or this temple that is made up of people, and it's a community of people where God is pleased to dwell, and it's all the problems of exile are reversed in this. So, for example, John chapter 2. Where Jesus says in verse 19, he says, Jesus answered, he's talking to the Jews. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Okay, destroy this temple. Well, that's what happened in the exile. Okay, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said it's taken 46 years to build this temple. So that they're talking about the second temple, the one that Ezra, and it was around the time of Ezra. But Herod went and completely sort of remodeled it for 46 years or so. It sort of became, much grander at that time. It's still the second temple, but it's, 46 years it's gone through a massive renovation project. So 46 years it's taken to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking about the temple of his body. And after the next verse talks about him being raised from the dead and the disciples believing. And there's this whole completely other idea, which we haven't got time to think about now at all. But the Psalms becomes like this window of thinking about exile and effectively exile and death and rebuilding and resurrection and new life and so on. And Jesus goes through it. He effectively goes through exile. He goes through death. He's destroyed. His body is destroyed. Is killed, and his life is taken from him. And then 3 days later, he's resurrected. He's raised from the dead, and that's like a rebuilding of a temple. And they're waiting for that. They're waiting for a temple that's rebuilt, that isn't just one that is has 46 years of Herod making it look nice and fancy with a palace and complex of things around it. They're looking for and really wanting God's presence to be in a temple, for God to dwell in with them, and for them to really have fellowship with God, and that's what they need. And Jesus is basically saying, I'm the answer. I'm the answer to the unfinished story of our scriptures. And pray the Psalms, and here I am. That's he's the one that's coming to fulfill it. There's one. Should we just look at Ephesians chapter 2?
Mm-hmm.
There's loads of places in the New Testament that talk about the temple and the people of who follow Jesus. So I don't know, Ephesians 2, towards the end of the chapter, maybe verse 19 to the end, if one of you wants to read that.
Okay. Ephesians 2:19. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit.
Yeah, so there we go. That's one expression of the community of people that are formed by what Jesus has done. A few verses back, it's talking about the blood of Christ and what he has done, and giving his life and being reconciled to God. This is all the language of the crisis in the Psalms, but then being brought back into fellowship with God and turned around and brought back out of exile and having a temple rebuilt, and this is effectively becomes something that we can experience, we can be a part of, and be a part of the temple that's built for God's presence, for God to dwell, for God to be pleased to be with these people, which is it's incredible. It's pretty mind-blowing, that is. And so that's how looking at the Psalms with the exile in mind, that helps us realize that there's this big picture. I think that's hopefully that's what's come out. There's a real big picture in the scriptures, and the Psalms is one bit of that, and that helps us really think through it. And we're not going to, almost certainly not going to go through the very similar situations like these people who went through and experienced the exile. and experienced times in Babylon where they felt they couldn't sing the Lord's song because they were far away from Zion and from Jerusalem. But we'll experience lots of trauma. We do experience terrible things that happen in our lives, and at different times. And being a human that's what happens. We're mortal. We're frail people, and we live in a cruel world. And there's all sorts of terrible things that happen. There's, we go through and deconstruct our worldviews and feel doubt and feel like we don't understand anything that's going around us, and we might feel like that. Those Psalms, Psalm 89, where is God and his steadfast love? But here Jesus has come and he's done that with us. He's destroyed this temple, and then 3 days later it was raised up. He's joined with, as a man just like us. He's experienced all that terrible trauma of exile, of death, of those terrible things, and yet God's raised him. And there's that hope, and there's that hope of us being able to be part of him, and be part of a community of people who are also with him as well, which is real. That is such a wonderful thing about being part of and sharing with other people, coming together who all are growing together as this structure that, as Ephesians says, growing together into a holy temple in the Lord. So there you go, exile, the lens of exile through the Psalms. There's sure there's lots more we could have looked at, but
well, that's the homework, as we said before, isn't it, Jord? See if you can look at some other Psalms of where exile might fit. Any concluding points, Jord, from you?
I just really like the point you said, Dan, about how the Psalms is almost like a songbook of how to deal with exile. And I think that's definitely a journey I've been on sort of in the last year. We've all been on a bit of a crazy journey with COVID and lockdown, and almost feeling like we're in exile from the world and the normality as to what we had. And I suppose as we start to see restrictions lifted and life, hopefully going a little bit more back to normal, what we start to realize is there'll be more, like you said, moments of trauma, moments of exile. Just because there's one thing that's sort of disappeared, another thing will pop up. And I think that the big thing that you've really highlighted for me tonight, as sort of I've reflected over the last 12 months as we've gone through this journey of going through the Psalm book, is that the Psalms can be a really powerful tool that we can use in these really difficult moments where we relate with real people, even if we don't know who that individual was. Was it Korah? Was it a descendant of Korah? Whoever it was, they were real people, and it was left for us by God, this book, wasn't it, to relate to and to help us through these moments, just like Jesus did, who we're joined to now, as you brought out. So that's, I think, something I'm really going to try and think on going forward. But thanks for your thoughts tonight. That was really comprehensive and really helpful in that sort of big picture view.
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's been really good to do it with you. So thanks a lot.
So thank you for coming on. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Jord. And thanks, everyone, for watching. Now's the time to go up. The sentence is not finished yet. Dan talked to us about. May God bless you all as you continue to seek God in these challenging times. Till next time. Bye.